December 1944. The Ardennes, a forest of black trunks and white silence, snow packed hard as concrete, breath turns to crystal in the dark. On a narrow Belgian road, an American column crawls forward like a wounded animal. Headlights taped, engines muffled. Men hunched inside coats that can't keep the cold out. Somewhere ahead, the trees burst with sudden white flashes. Artillery air bursts. Splinters of wood scythe through the air. Then the lead tank edges into view. Too tall, too square-shouldered, carrying its weight like a prize fighter. Not a standard Sherman. This one looks swollen with armor. Its turret face thick and blunt. Its hull front heavier than it has any right to be. The M4A3R2, Jumbo. German anti-tank teams in the tree line had seen Shermans burn before. They had learned to expect it. A Panzerfaust, a well-sighted gun, one clean shot into the right plate, and the road would clog with fire. But this tank doesn't react the way the battlefield expects. It keeps coming, and as it advances, the laughter, if there ever was any, dies into calculation. By the winter of 1944, the war in Western Europe looked, at a distance, like a story nearing its end. Paris had been liberated in August. Allied headlines spoke in the language of momentum. A broad front pushed east, and on paper the German army was falling back toward its own border, its cities already under the weight of strategic bombing, its fuel reserves shrinking, its veteran formations bled down. But wars don't end because a map trends the right way. On the ground, the Allied advance was beginning to fray at the edges. The speed of the breakout from Normandy had created its own enemy, distance. Every mile east pulled supplies farther from the ports and depots that fed the armies. Trucks wore out, roads clogged. Ammunition and fuel became the true currency of operations, so precious that divisions sometimes paused, not because the enemy stopped them, but because their logistics did. Germany, meanwhile, was living a contradiction. The Reich was losing the war, but it was still capable of killing in concentrated bursts. The German army no longer had the freedom to choose many strategic options, which made it more dangerous in the few places it could. What it lacked in fuel and air power, it tried to compensate for with surprise, terrain, and disciplined defensive fire. And as the autumn rains gave way to hard winter, a familiar truth returned to the front. Weather is a weapon. Low cloud and snow blunted Allied air support, one of the great advantages the Western Allies had come to rely on. Visibility shrank, roads iced, vehicles bogged, and in forests and villages, combat returned to short ranges, where a single hidden gun or a single infantryman with a shape-charged weapon could decide the fate of a tank. In December, the Ardennes region sat like a quiet seam in the Allied line, a rugged stretch of hills and thick forests straddling Belgium and Luxembourg. It wasn't empty. No sector in wartime ever truly is, but it was considered less likely to be the site of a major German offensive. The terrain seemed ill-suited for massed armor. The weather was brutal. The Allied front was stretched thin across it, guarded in places by divisions resting, refitting, or newly arrived, and still learning the country. That assumption, quiet sector, low risk, was exactly what German planners intended to exploit. The German offensive that began on 16th December 1944 was not simply a gamble. It was a concentrated attempt to change the war's political and military geometry in one violent thrust. The aim was to rupture the Allied line, drive through the Ardennes to the Meuse River, and seize Antwerp, splitting British and American forces and collapsing Allied operational cohesion. It was a plan built on speed, shock, and the belief that the Western Allies might fracture under sudden crisis. But even the boldest plans are made of fragile things. Germany's ability to execute depended on fuel it scarcely had, on roads that could choke, on units moving through snow and forest while Allied artillery hunted them, and on capturing Allied supply dumps fast enough to keep the spearheads alive. It depended on timing, on the weather staying bad enough to keep Allied aircraft grounded, and on confusion spreading faster than the Allies could coordinate a response. In the first days, confusion did spread. The front buckled. Small American units fought isolated actions in villages and road junctions, delaying forces that outweighed them. Convoys turned around on clogged roads. Command posts shifted. Messages arrived late or not at all. In this environment, every intersection mattered. Every bridge mattered. Every narrow road, threading through trees, became a potential killing corridor. And that is where tanks stopped being symbols and became necessities. Because the Ardennes offensive, soon known to the world as the Battle of the Bulge, did not unfold as a clean sweep of sweeping armored maneuvers. Not in the way propaganda would later frame it. It became, in countless places, a brutal series of close fights, roadblocks, ambushes, village squares, wooded ridges, and burning wrecks that narrowed movement to single lanes. In those constricted lanes, a tank's survival was not theoretical. It was immediate. It was measured in whether its frontal armor could withstand the first shot, because if it couldn't, the column behind it would freeze in place, and men would die in the open, pinned on icy roads with no cover but ditches and dead vehicles. So as German armored formations and infantry surged forward into the Ardennes, the Americans rushed to stabilize the line with what they had. Infantry dug in around crossroads, artillery firing into likely approaches, engineers blowing bridges or clearing mines, and armored units thrown into the most desperate gaps. And among those armored units, there existed a Sherman variant built for a job that suddenly mattered more than anyone had hoped it would: to take the hit first and still move. The story of the jumbo begins before it reaches the snow, back in the cold logic of production and the hot reality of tank-killing weapons. The M4 Sherman was never meant to be a single frozen design. It was a family built for mass production, repairability, and the grinding demands of a global war. Its real strength was not that it was perfect, but that it arrived in numbers, could be maintained in the field, and could be adapted as new threats appeared. And by 1943-1944, the threats had sharpened. Across Northwest Europe, American tank crews learned the same lesson in different accents and landscapes. In the wrong place at the wrong range, a Sherman could die quickly. German anti-tank doctrine was layered and patient. Guns were sighted to cover roads and open ground. Infantry teams hunted from hedgerows, ruins, and tree lines with shaped charge weapons that didn't need high velocity, only proximity and nerve. The battlefield offered countless firing positions where a tank might meet the first shot without warning. For the U.S. Army, the answer was not a single miracle vehicle. It was combined arms, artillery, infantry, engineers, air power when weather allowed, and a constant effort to refine tactics and equipment while the war continued. Upgunned Shermans, better ammunition, improved training, more aggressive reconnaissance, smoke and coordination with tank destroyers all played roles. But there was also another answer, more blunt, more literal. Armor. The concept behind the M4A3E2 Jumbo was shaped by a problem that commanders could describe in one sentence. We need a tank that can lead the way into the worst fire and stay alive long enough for everyone else to follow. Not a new main battle tank to replace the Sherman family, but a specialized assault tank, an armored battering ram within existing logistics and production realities. So the Jumbo was built on a Sherman chassis, but with a different purpose in its bones. It carried significantly heavier armor than the standard Shermans around it, especially at the front, where so many lethal encounters began. Its silhouette did not disappear into the terrain. If anything, it looked heavier simply standing still. The turret face, the hull front, thickened, strengthened, designed to absorb punishment that would cripple a normal tank. The trade-off was not hidden. More armor meant more weight. More weight meant slower acceleration, harder strain on drivetrain components, and less agility on bad ground. In a war where mobility was often life, the Jumbo made a different bargain. Survival first, movement second. And that bargain shaped how it was used. Jumbos were not issued in huge numbers. They were relatively few precious assets, arriving in limited batches. They tended to be allocated where the need for an assault tank was most immediate, where a unit had to crack a defended line, take a village under direct fire, or push through a roadblock that could halt an entire attack. In practice, many armored units used the Jumbo as a point tank, the lead vehicle, the one that edges forward first into the unknown, the one that draws fire that would otherwise kill thinner-skinned tanks or exposed infantry. Sometimes it served as the magnet, taking hits, while other tanks maneuvered, infantry moved, and engineers worked under its protection. That role did not make it invincible. No tank in World War II was. Even the thickest armor could be defeated at close range from the flank or by heavy guns in good positions. Mines didn't care about turret faces. Mechanical breakdown could immobilize any vehicle, and in a constrained road network, an immobilized tank could become a burning obstacle or a steel bunker, depending on the next 10 minutes. But what the Jumbo did offer was time. Time to survive the first shot. Time to keep the road open. Time for the men behind it to dismount, deploy, and fight with some chance of coordination instead of panic. The irony is that this is exactly the kind of vehicle that can be misunderstood by an enemy observing it at a distance. German troops were experienced. They had fought Shermans across France and the Low Countries. They knew their weapons. In many engagements, they expected American armor to behave in certain ways under fire, halt, back up, burn, or be forced into awkward flanking maneuvers. Confidence was often earned. At typical combat ranges, and with good positioning, German anti-tank guns and infantry weapons could be devastating. So when something that looks like a Sherman refuses to die like a Sherman, the battlefield's assumptions start to crack. Not with jokes, not with speeches, with hurried corrections, new aim points, calls for heavier weapons, a shift in tactics from stop it here to get around it. The sudden realization that a roadblock built to kill the first tank might not be enough. And in the Ardennes, where everything narrowed to roads, villages, and forest corridors, that realization could decide whether an advance stalled, whether a defense held, or whether a trapped unit had a way out. Because the Battle of the Bulge was a fight of movement and paralysis. Columns surged until they hit steel and fire. Then everything stopped, and when everything stops in winter, men freeze, fuel runs out, and the enemy regroups. The Jumbo's story, then, is not simply about armor thickness or vehicle specifications. It's about what happens when a rare tool meets the exact kind of battlefield it was built for, where a single tank's ability to keep moving can pull an entire formation through a choke point. And to understand why that mattered, we have to look at the same moment from different angles, through the eyes of crews, commanders, and the men waiting in the trees with weapons designed for the kill. Inside a tank in December 1944, the cold is not outside. It's everywhere. Steel holds temperature like a memory. When the engine is off, the interior becomes a refrigerator that bites through gloves and wool. When the engine is on, heat gathers in pockets, then vanishes the moment a hatch cracks open. Condensation fogs vision blocks. Frost rims metal surfaces. A man's breath becomes another layer of moisture waiting to freeze. The Jumbo's extra armor changes the crew's psychology in a way that's difficult to measure and impossible to ignore. Standard Sherman crews had already absorbed the war's arithmetic. Frontal plate, range, enemy gun, probability becomes instinct. You don't need to know the exact millimeters to know what it means when a shot hits you, and the tank doesn't immediately die. It's not comfort, it's not safety, it's something smaller and more urgent. It's the ability to keep functioning after impact. A hit on armor is not a clean event. It's a concussion that rings through your ribs. It's paint dust and metal grit in the air. It's the fear that comes with the smell of hot steel and the possibility of fire. Even when the round fails to penetrate, the crew's bodies absorb the violence. And if you're the lead tank, you don't just take the first shot. You take the first moment of doubt. Yet that's exactly where the Jumbo is placed. At the front, where hesitation spreads like disease. Because if the lead tank reverses in panic, the whole column behind it becomes a traffic jam in the snow. Men dismount into open ground. Wounded have nowhere to go. Orders turn into shouting. A single well-timed enemy barrage can turn that road into a graveyard. So the Jumbo's crew learns a strange discipline, to keep moving while the world tries to convince you to stop. And the road ahead doesn't widen, it tightens. In open country, tanks can choose their fights. In the Ardennes, the country chooses for them. Forests compress vision. Hills hide guns. Villages funnel vehicles into streets that become narrow corridors of brick and stone. Snow pushes everything toward the few usable roads, and those roads become predictable, meaning they become trapped. A normal armored advance wants space, room to spread out, to scout, to flank, to bring multiple guns to bear. But in December 1944, many engagements weren't fought like textbook tank battles. They were fought like ambushes. A column rounds a bend, a bridge approaches, a village edge appears through snow haze. Then, suddenly, the first vehicle is hit, maybe a mine, maybe a shell, maybe an anti-tank gun, firing from a well-chosen angle. And when the first vehicle blocks the road, it becomes more than a wreck. It becomes a plug. Everything behind it is trapped in line. Vehicles cannot easily turn around. Tanks can't always leave the road without bogging or exposing thin side armor. Infantry can't magically appear on the enemy flank. Artillery support may be delayed by communications and by terrain. Even a small enemy team, if positioned correctly, can stall a formation much larger than itself. This is why lead tanks mattered so much in the Bulge. Not because they were heroic symbols, but because they were practical tools in the physics of the battlefield. If the point tank can take a hit and still function, the entire formation retains initiative. If it cannot, the enemy gains time. And time is what the German offensive needed most. The Jumbo's armor turns it into a wedge for exactly these situations, the places where the road narrows, and the first impact decides whether anyone moves at all. German anti-tank defense in 1944 was not improvised. It was a craft. Crews learned to sight guns where targets would have limited choices. Road junctions, village edges, bends in roads where a tank must briefly show its front. Infantry teams with Panzerfausts hid in cellars, ditches, and tree lines, waiting for the moment a tank slowed or a column halted. The goal was not always to destroy an entire force. It was to kill the first vehicle, clog the road, then harvest the confusion. Against most Shermans, that approach could be brutally effective. Many German troops had already seen Shermans knocked out by the weapons available to them. They knew that American tanks could be stopped, sometimes quickly, if the first shot struck the right place. But the Jumbo changes the enemy's problem. It looks familiar enough to invite routine. It tempts the gunner into a standard solution. And then, the first round hits, and the expected result doesn't arrive. No immediate penetration, no bloom of flame, no crew bailing out into the snow. That failure is not just technical, it's psychological. Because an ambush is a timing machine. It relies on shock to freeze a target and accelerate panic. When the shock doesn't work, the machine starts to break down. The American tank keeps coming. The infantry behind it begins to move instead of scatter. The defenders must choose, fire again, and hope, shift to a flank shot that may not be possible, or call for heavier weapons that may not be nearby. And in the Ardennes, those seconds are expensive. They are expensive because the Jumbo is not alone. It is a door being forced open. And once a door opens on a winter battlefield, the violence behind it pours through. The next angle is the cold mathematics behind that door. How armor, distance, and weapon design decide who lives long enough to fire again. A tank's armor does not make it fearless. It makes it harder to kill in the first 10 seconds. On paper, armor is thickness, angle, metallurgy, welding quality. In combat, armor is a shifting set of probabilities shaped by range and impact angle, by whether a gun is firing level, uphill, or from the side, by whether the round strikes flat plate or a curve, by whether it hits a weak point, a seam, or a mounting. The Jumbo's defining feature is its heavier protection concentrated where a point tank needs it, most the frontal arc. That changes the geometry of an ambush. The defender's easy solutions narrow. A weapon that might penetrate a standard Sherman at a certain distance now needs to be closer, more square on, more precise, or it needs to aim for different places. And different places are never as simple as they sound, because in the Ardennes, closing distance means moving through snow and forest, while a tank's machine gun and supporting infantry sweep the edges. It means exposing yourself longer. It means taking a gamble of your own. Meanwhile, the tank doesn't need to be perfect. It only needs to remain functional, able to traverse the turret, fire, and crawl forward. This is why a tank that survives a non-penetrating hit still changes the battle. The first shot that fails does not merely fail to kill. It reveals a position. It invites return fire. It forces the ambusher to reload, re-aim, and commit again. It buys time for the column behind to deploy. The jumbo is not magic steel. It is engineered delay forced onto the enemy's kill chain. And in winter fighting, delay is sometimes the difference between a stalled road and a broken roadblock. Commanders didn't treat jumbos like ordinary Shermans, because they couldn't. They were too few, too specialized, and too useful in specific problems. In a unit, if you had one, it tended to become a deliberate choice, assigned not by habit, but by necessity. The jumbo was sent where the fight promised close-range fire, where choke points would decide the day, where the lead tank might have to bully a path through something that refused to move. That meant villages. That meant bridges. That meant road junctions that everyone on both sides could find on a map. It also meant a kind of grim leadership calculation. If you put the jumbo in front, you increase the chance the column survives the first ambush. But you also guarantee the jumbo will be shot at first, again and again, until either the enemy runs out of chances or the tank runs out of luck. Heavy armor tempts commanders to use it like a shield, and shields attract blows. So doctrine had to be paired with discipline. The jumbo leads, but it is supported. Infantry must be close enough to protect it from short-range threats. Other tanks must be positioned to cover flanks and provide volume of fire. Engineers must be ready for mines and obstacles. Artillery must be responsive when the fight locks in place. The jumbo is not a lone hero vehicle. It is a focal point around which combined arms can organize in the worst terrain, an anchor in the chaos, so the larger machine can keep functioning. And when German pressure surged in the Bulge, functioning was everything. It's easy to talk about tanks as machines. It's harder to talk about what they are built to do to human bodies. An assault tank like the jumbo exists because infantry in the open are fragile. When a road is swept by machine gun fire, when shells detonate in treetops and throw splinters through coats and skin, men on foot can be pinned, shredded, or frozen into immobility. Armor offers not just firepower, but the ability to move under fire, something a man cannot do without paying in blood. So the jumbo's armor is more than technical. It is an operational triage. If a lead tank can absorb hits that would otherwise destroy a standard tank, the infantry behind it may get to the next ditch, the next wall, the next doorway. Casualties may shift from an exposed platoon to a crew sealed inside steel. That is not a clean moral victory. It is simply a different distribution of risk, decided by planners and commanders and the brutal logic of necessity. And the crew inside the jumbo understands this, even when no one says it aloud. They are not just leading because they are confident. They are leading because their vehicle gives everyone else a better chance. But that chance is not free. The enemy adapts. If frontal armor doesn't work, the enemy looks for side shots, mines, close attacks. If the lead tank can't be killed quickly, it can be immobilized, surrounded, set on fire, or forced into a position where escape becomes impossible. In the Ardennes, where roads narrow and visibility collapses, survival can depend on inches of clearance and seconds of decision-making. So the moral reality of the jumbo is this. It is built to endure the first impact, so that the people behind it can do their jobs without dying in the first minute. And that takes us directly into the turning point of the story, when the Bulge becomes a fight of bottlenecks and brute force, and the jumbo is pushed into the exact kind of moment it was designed for. The Ardennes doesn't announce an ambush with drama. It announces it with absence. A road goes quiet. The trees stand too still. The villages ahead show no movement. No civilians, no smoke from chimneys, no dogs, no carts. Even sound feels muffled, swallowed by snow and low cloud. Then the first sign arrives, not as a sight, but as impact. A crack like a giant whip, followed by a metallic punch that vibrates through a tank's hull and into the teeth of the men inside. In the opening days of the German offensive, American units repeatedly found themselves fighting to keep roads from becoming traps. A column could be moving, organized, confident. Then one shell, one mine, one well-placed anti-tank gun could turn its lead vehicle into an obstacle. And in the Ardennes, obstacles weren't inconveniences. They were choke points where artillery could bracket the road and infantry could close in. So when armored reinforcements arrived to stem the Bulge, they were often thrown directly into half-formed crises. Blocked routes, threatened junctions, infantry pinned in villages, engineers trying to clear mines under fire. And that is where the Jumbo's extra armor stopped being an abstract concept and became a job description. Picture a typical winter approach. A village sits. Ahead, its buildings crouch low and dark against the snow. The road curves into it between trees, then narrows as stone walls and houses press close. Somewhere inside, or just beyond, German defenders wait. They may have an anti-tank gun covering the entry. They may have Panzerfaust teams positioned along the first row of buildings, waiting for a tank to slow as it threads the choke point. They may have mined the approach. They may have registered artillery on the road. The Americans can't simply avoid the village if the road is the only route for fuel, ammunition, evacuations, and movement. They can't always bypass the threat through the forest. Snow and soft ground can swallow vehicles, and leaving the road often exposes thinner side armor and breaks formation. They can't always wait for perfect conditions, because the German offensive is a race against time. Delay gives the enemy what he came for, so the approach becomes an act of controlled violence. The Jumbo is placed forward, not because it is invulnerable, but because it can take what would cripple a normal Sherman long enough to force a decision. It edges toward the entry, turret scanning, machine gun ready, the rest of the formation behind it, in a tight, nervous queue. The first round comes in, often without warning. A hit that would be catastrophic on a thinner plate may, on the Jumbo's frontal armor, become a hammer blow instead of a death sentence. Inside, the crew feels the concussion. They taste cordite and hot metal. They listen for the sounds that matter: fire, penetration, screaming. If those sounds don't come, the decision arrives instantly and brutally. Keep moving, because stopping is what the enemy wants. The Jumbo continues forward, and that motion forces the defenders to reveal themselves more clearly. An anti-tank gun firing again is easier to locate. A Panzerfaust team shifting position exposes silhouettes in a doorway or behind a wall. A muzzle flash in a window becomes a target for the Jumbo's gun, or for the tanks behind it now beginning to fan their fire into the buildings and tree line. This is where the tank becomes not just armor, but a spotlight. Every time the enemy fires, the enemy speaks. The Jumbo's survival lets the Americans listen long enough to answer, and the answers in the Bulge were not subtle. They were high explosive into suspected gun pits. They were machine gun bursts into hedgerows and windows. They were smoke rounds to blind an anti-tank position while infantry worked around the edge. They were artillery called onto crossroads to break up reinforcements. But none of that works if the road is blocked at the first impact. This is the turning pressure of the Bulge, an offensive built on movement meets terrain built for paralysis. German units needed to punch through quickly before fuel and weather and Allied reserves caught up. American units needed to slow, then hold, then counterattack. And to do that, they needed the roads open. When a lead tank can survive and keep moving, it doesn't just save itself. It keeps a corridor alive. Still, there is always a moment when the protection is tested beyond theory. Close range collapses advantage. In a village street, distances shrink to tens of meters. An enemy team can wait behind a corner, step out, fire a shaped charge into a side plate, and disappear. A mine can rip a track and immobilize even the toughest vehicle. A heavy gun can land a shot in the exact place armor is weakest, or simply strike repeatedly until metal gives way. So the Jumbo's breakthrough is never a straight line. It is a grinding, tense process of inches and angles. The crew must keep the strongest armor facing the threat. The supporting infantry must stay close enough to keep Germans from creeping in with close-range weapons. The tanks behind must avoid bunching up, because a single shell into a tight cluster can create a chain reaction of blocked movement and burning wrecks. And all of this happens under a sky that feels too low, with snow that reflects muzzle flashes, like camera bulbs. In these moments, the laughing becomes something else entirely. Not mockery, but the confidence of an ambush that expects the first tank to die. When it doesn't, the confidence turns into urgency. German gunners fire faster. Panzerfaust teams shift to closer angles. Orders are shouted. The defenders improvise because the planned kill didn't happen on schedule. And that is when the fight truly breaks open, when the first failed kill forces the enemy to overcommit, and the American column uses the opening to turn a stalled road into forward motion. The climax of the Jumbo's story in the Bulge is not a single cinematic explosion. It is the moment a choke point stops being a wall and becomes a door. When the lead tank takes the blow, stays alive, and keeps the entire formation from freezing in place. Because once a door opens in the Ardennes, what comes through it is not just steel, it is momentum. Momentum in the Ardennes is never clean. It comes in fragments, released by a single obstacle removed, a single gun silenced, a single bend in the road finally cleared. When the Jumbo forces that first opening, everything behind it begins to change shape. A stalled column becomes a deployment. Half-frozen infantry step off the road and into cover with purpose instead of panic. Radios that were full of confusion begin to carry coordinates. Engineers move forward with mine detectors and wire cutters instead of waiting helplessly behind burning wrecks. The second and third tanks, no longer trapped by the fear of instant destruction, start laying down disciplined fire. High explosive into windows, machine gun bursts into tree lines, smoke to blind whatever can't yet be reached. And the enemy feels the shift immediately, because an ambush is designed to win fast. German defenders in the Bulge often fought with a brutal economy of effort. Kill the lead vehicle. Block the road, then use that blockage to destroy what can't move. It is a method that turns small forces into large effects. But it only works if the first kill happens on schedule. So when the first kill doesn't happen, when the Jumbo takes the hit and remains a fighting machine, the entire defensive plan starts to unravel into improvisation. The German gunner must fire again and again, staying in place longer. A Panzerfaust team must creep closer, exposing itself to supporting infantry. A commander who intended to delay and withdraw is forced to decide whether to commit more men to the trap or abandon it before American firepower consolidates. That decision is the hinge, because the Bulge is full of moments where German units, seeking speed, are pulled into time-consuming fights they cannot afford. Every extra minute spent trying to kill a stubborn lead tank is a minute spent not advancing. Every round fired is fuel and ammunition consumed for a result that was supposed to be quick. And behind the German spearheads, the logistical tail, already fragile, stretches and strains along icy roads. For the Americans, the stakes are inverted. Time is survival. The longer an American unit can keep a road open, the more reinforcements can arrive. The longer a crossroads can be held, the more artillery can be brought to bear. The longer a corridor exists, the more wounded can be evacuated, and the more supplies can reach the front. A single armored wedge that prevents a road from being sealed can determine whether a pocket becomes a massacre or a defense becomes a stand. The Jumbo's breakthrough, then, is not only physical, it is psychological. There's a specific kind of fear that spreads when armor dies quickly. Men stop trusting the machines meant to shield them. Infantry hesitate to follow tanks into open ground. Tank crews hesitate to crest a ridge or enter a village street. Once that hesitation takes hold, it multiplies casualties, because war punishes uncertainty. But when a tank takes a direct hit and keeps moving, the fear changes direction. It does not vanish, but it becomes manageable. The men behind the Jumbo can believe for a few minutes that the next step won't automatically be the last. That belief is enough to restore coordination, and coordination is what turns firepower into results. Now the fight tightens to its most dangerous phase. The enemy adapts close. If a frontal kill is unlikely at range, German infantry weapons become more relevant, especially in villages and forests. A shaped charge weapon doesn't need to defeat armor by brute force the way an old anti-tank rifle might. It needs angle, proximity, and the nerve to step into the open at the worst moment. The Jumbo's armor makes that approach harder, not impossible. It forces the attacker to seek side shots, rear shots, or weak points, meaning the attacker must come nearer, stay longer, and risk being seen. That is why the Jumbo is most effective when it is not alone. Supporting infantry are not decoration. They are the close-range security system. They scan doorways, hedgerows, and ditches. They move with the tank, using its bulk for cover, while preventing the enemy from creeping into the blind zones. The jumbo can take the first blow, but it cannot see everything, and it cannot protect its own flanks the way a human with a rifle can. When this combined movement works, the breakthrough becomes a chain reaction. A roadblock collapses, and suddenly trucks begin to pass. A village edge is forced, and suddenly artillery observers can see farther. A stalled unit finds a route out, and suddenly German pressure fails to close the trap. The jumbo's armor doesn't just absorb shells, it absorbs the enemy's plan to freeze the battlefield into immobility. And as the Americans stabilize, the larger reality of the Bulge begins to reassert itself. German units that surged forward early now find themselves fighting in a narrowing corridor. Fuel shortages bite. Vehicles are abandoned. Attacks lose synchronization. The weather that once grounded Allied aircraft begins to lift in intervals. And with clearer skies comes another layer of pressure. Airstrikes, reconnaissance, and the return of an Allied advantage Germany could not match. But even before the skies clear, the Bulge starts to turn because the offensive cannot remain a pure movement operation. It becomes a series of forced fights, each one consuming German time and strength. In that environment, an assault tank like the Jumbo matters not by changing the entire war, but by changing the immediate math at the decisive points. It turns a first-shot kill into a first-shot failure. It forces German defenders to spend more, risk more, and stay longer. At the exact time, they can afford none of it. By the time a column pushes through and the road ahead finally opens into the next stretch of forest, the Jumbo's hull may be scarred with impact marks. Its crew may be shaken, half deaf from concussion, running on adrenaline and routines. The infantry behind may be exhausted, their faces cracked from cold, their fingers stiff on triggers. But they are moving, and movement, in the Battle of the Bulge, is the first sign that the offensive has begun to lose its grip. That the German surge has found not a clean break in the Allied line, but a stubborn, armored resistance that refuses to collapse on schedule. The climax is over, not when the guns fall silent, but when the road is no longer a trap. Because once the road is kept alive, consequences begin to roll outward, into casualties counted, towns reclaimed, and strategies rewritten. And that is where the story goes next. When the immediate fight ends, the Ardennes doesn't feel like victory. It feels like exhaustion, with smoke in it. A road that was blocked an hour ago might now be open, but it is littered with the evidence of how close collapse came. Cratered verges, shattered trees, abandoned gear half buried in snow. Burned-out vehicles sit like black monuments, their metal warped and iced over. The air smells of fuel, cordite, and wet ash. Men move with the careful slowness of people who have been running on adrenaline and now have to count what remains. For a tank crew, survived is a complicated word. A jumbo that takes hits and keeps moving may still be damaged in ways that don't show up on a photograph. A non-penetrating strike can jar systems out of alignment. Spalling and fragments can injure inside even without a full breakthrough. Vision devices can crack, tracks can be loosened. A tank can become mechanically fragile at the exact moment it is needed for another push. In winter conditions, even minor damage becomes serious. A broken component can't always be repaired quickly in the open, with numb hands and enemy artillery still searching the roads. And then there is the human toll inside the steel. Concussion, shock, the trembling that arrives once the firing stops. The delayed realization of how close the round came to finding a seam, a weak plate, a flanking angle. The crew's job is to reset immediately, reload, refuel, check the engine, scan the horizon, because the Bulge does not offer long pauses. A road cleared at noon might be contested again by dusk. For the infantry nearby, the aftermath is measured in smaller, harsher units. Frostbitten fingers, empty canteens, missing men. The Ardennes is winter, punished bodies as reliably as enemy fire. Even successful actions were paid for in exhaustion. A platoon that held a crossroads through the night might look intact on paper, but the faces told the truth. Sleep-deprived, hollow-eyed, stunned by the constant pressure. Yet the tactical consequences of a breakthrough were immediate and real. When a choke point is forced, the flow behind it resumes. Ammunition can reach forward positions. Medical evacuation can move rearward. Artillery pieces can be repositioned. Reserves can arrive where they were previously delayed. In the Bulge, those logistics were not background. They were the fight itself. German success depended on disrupting Allied movement and capturing supplies. Allied survival depended on keeping lines open long enough for the weight of reinforcements and firepower to settle onto the battlefield. This is where the jumbo's impact is most honestly seen, not in romantic myth, but in tasks accomplished. An assault tank that could lead through heavy fire meant fewer stalled columns. Fewer stalled columns meant fewer exposed men trapped in open roads. Fewer traffic jams meant artillery and engineers could do their work with time and spacing. And time and spacing meant German attacks were less able to exploit panic and paralysis. In individual engagements, the effect could be stark. A standard Sherman knocked out at the head of a column might turn a road into a killing lane. A jumbo that endured long enough to move past the danger point could prevent that scenario from ever forming. Even when a jumbo was eventually immobilized or forced back, it often did so after the rest of the formation had deployed, after the infantry had taken cover and the supporting fires had found their rhythm. That difference, minutes, sometimes seconds, changed casualty lists. Of course, no single vehicle type decided the Battle of the Bulge. The German offensive was blunted by a combination of factors: stubborn defensive actions, rapid American reinforcement, massive artillery response, and, when the weather lifted, the return of Allied air power. But within that larger machinery, the Bulge was made up of countless small fights at narrow points. And in those narrow points, a tank designed to take the first blow mattered more than its production numbers suggested. The aftermath also carried a quieter consequence: recognition on both sides, repeated contact with a heavily armored Sherman variant, forced adjustments. Americans learned where the jumbo was most valuable, and where even its armor couldn't substitute for infantry support and careful movement. Germans learned that not every Sherman on the road would behave the same way under fire, meaning an ambush that relied on routine could fail at the worst moment. Those lessons did not appear as grand proclamations. They appeared as altered behavior: different target selection, different weapon choices, different urgency in closing range or calling heavier guns. And as the fighting continued through late December into January, those accumulated adjustments became part of the larger closing of the Bulge, where German momentum bled away and the Allies began to push back. Because what follows the first crisis is always the same in war: the accounting, not just of losses and gains, but of what the battle proved and what it exposed about the limits of steel. As the Bulge began to shrink, its meaning sharpened. Germany's offensive had achieved surprise and early penetration, but it did not achieve its strategic goal. The deeper the spearheads pushed, the more they became dependent on roads they couldn't fully control and fuel they couldn't reliably supply. In the Ardennes, geography is not generous. There are only so many routes that heavy vehicles can take in winter, and every route becomes predictable once it's forced into use. Predictability invites artillery. Predictability invites air power when clouds lift. Predictability invites encirclement. By late December, the initial shock was fading. American units, battered and dislocated, reformed into coherent lines, key bastions of resistance, road junctions, towns, and ridges, held long enough for larger counter-movements to form. And as January arrived, the Allied counteroffensive began to compress the German salient, pushing it back toward the lines it had ruptured. In this larger outcome, the jumbo Sherman sits in an important but limited place. It was not a war-winning invention. It did not replace the Sherman fleet. It did not erase the dangers of the battlefield. What it did, quietly, brutally, and in the exact places where it was needed, was change the local balance of survival in the first contact. In the Ardennes, many fights turned on the ability to keep a road from becoming a tomb. The jumbo's heavier frontal protection made it a practical tool for that problem. It could be used as a lead tank in situations where a commander expected direct fire into the approach. It could act as a mobile shield while infantry moved. It could nose into streets and hold angles long enough for supporting weapons to find targets. And just as importantly, the Jumbo demonstrated a truth that had been chasing every army in World War II. Specialization is powerful, but scarcity is destiny. Because an assault tank that arrives only in small numbers becomes something you spend. You choose where to risk it. You choose where to protect it. You cannot be everywhere. So its influence is felt most intensely in the narrowest spaces, the crossroads, the village entrances, the bridges, where the battle compresses into a single lane and a single decision. The Bulge also forced a wider reckoning about how Allied forces fought armor battles in constricted terrain. It reinforced that tanks are not independent actors, especially not in forests and villages. Without infantry, even the thickest vehicle can be stalked at close range. Without engineers, mines and obstacles can freeze and advance regardless of armor. Without artillery, defenders in good positions can trade time for blood. Armor can lead, but it must be part of a system. The Jumbo worked best when that system functioned around it, when infantry kept close, when other tanks covered flanks, when commanders resisted the temptation to treat heavy armor as invulnerability. For German forces, the aftermath carried its own grim lesson. The Ardennes offensive was, in part, a bet that the Allies could be split and shocked into strategic crisis. Instead, it revealed the Allies' capacity to absorb surprise and then respond with overwhelming material and coordination. When the weather cleared, German movement became more visible and more vulnerable. Fuel shortages became catastrophic. Vehicles were abandoned, attacks lost their tempo. And when tempo dies in an offensive, the offensive becomes a retreat wearing the last scraps of ambition. In that retreat, the Jumbo becomes symbolic in a way it never asked to be. Not as a superweapon, but as a reminder that battlefield reputation is fragile. German anti-tank confidence, earned by experience, ran into a vehicle that complicated the familiar routine. It didn't make German weapons harmless. It didn't make American advances painless. It simply forced the enemy to work harder, risk more, and spend more time at the exact points where time was the most precious resource of all. By the time the Bulge was reduced and the front stabilized again, the landscape it left behind looked like the physical record of that truth. Forests shredded by shell fire, villages gutted, roads lined with wrecks and frozen ruts, and men who had learned that winter magnifies everything. Fear, pain, and the value of a machine that can keep moving when it should have stopped. And in the quiet that follows that kind of battle, a final question hangs in the air, heavier than statistics, and more enduring than any single tank model. What does it mean to build steel strong enough to carry human beings into hell, and then ask them to drive forward anyway? That question is where the story closes.